The top 1% of India's population earns 6 to 7% of the total income, and the top 10% earn more than 30% of the total income. Bottom 50% has to share just 22% of the total income. Now, that's not all. For 3 years since 2017, the income of the top 1% has grown at a pace of 15% per annum. Income of the bottom 50% has grown by just 3.9%, indicating greater inequality. And this is the worst. Income of the bottom 10% fell by 1%. These are some of the grim statistics compiled by Professor Amit Kapoor of Stanford University for the Institute for Competitiveness. The report, titled State of Inequality in India, urges the government, among other recommendations, to introduce a basic income for all Indians and also possibly an employment guarantee scheme for urban areas like the MNREGS for rural areas. Today, I have with me the author of the report himself, Professor Amit Kapoor, Honorary Chairman at the Institute of Competitiveness and visiting scholar, lecturer at Stanford University, as I said, Dr. Charan Singh, CEO of eGrow Foundation, an economist who has read it closely, this report, and Dr. Shamikant Ghosh, Group Chief Economic Advisor, State Bank of India, a person who would know a lot of macros of the Indian economy. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. Dr. Kapoor, first to you. We have all of half an hour to discuss the report. So what would the key finding be in terms of inequality? How grim is it? Is it getting worse?
So, this is a very important question that the country has to grapple with in terms of understanding as to what is inequality and how do we define inequality? Is it just going to be about income inequality, or we have to really have a much more deeper view of understanding what inequality or inequity means? So for the purposes of the report, what we have clearly said is it is just not about income inequality that we have to understand or look at. We have to go deeper and look at a far broader meaning of what inequity actually means. So what we have really done here is that we have tried to look at things like households, what are the kind of things that they have, to the basic expenses on medical care, and so on and so forth. So we have looked at a more integrative view of understanding what inequality or inequity means. So one of the most important parts that we have actually seen is the kind of inequity or inequality that exists from a income profile point of view. And as you've actually said in the beginning, the startling figures are that if you're actually making something like 25,000 rupees a month, which is close to 300,000 rupees a year, you would be in top 10% of the country. And I'm not talking about any data which is beyond the Government of India data. We have looked at the PLFS data. And that is what we have actually found. And this is something very, very important to note. The next thing is, if you really look at the top 10%, they make equivalent to something like 64% of the bottom 64%. So there is that whole huge disparity that exists. But now the question is, if we just look at the income levels, it could look like a very, very negative figure, but there are huge positives as well. What we have found is that as the country has moved forward, and especially in the last 5 to 6 years, we have seen a profound change that has actually happened positively. Say a very simple statistic that does emerge is in terms of the availability of, say, public healthcare centers. They have increased over a period of time, and they've increased by at least 10% in the last few years, at least in the last 5 to 8 years. If you really look at the availability of toilets, and that is again a very huge thing that has happened. So today what we see is that there is access of toilets for within schools and the drinking water facilities in schools. And that is a very important step that has happened. So close to about 96% of the schools today have access to toilets and drinking water. And that actually has a huge bearing in terms of how people are able to go to schools, especially for the girl child. So there is this important thing that actually comes through. Of course, there are positives in terms of how overall stunting is reduced, but we also see that there is a clear evidence that anemia has actually increased over a period of time. But above this, there is a question in terms of how do we really look at what does middle class mean in India, and we need to actually create a better definition of what income profiles are, or what income categories are.
From the definition you're saying, our middle class ends with the top 10%, right?
So I would suspect, like, the question is, this is again a point of debate as to what do we really say, like, is middle class something like 25,000 a month, or is it going to be lower than that, or is it supposed to be higher than that? That's a question of debate that is actually fairly open, because we have not looked at it from that perspective.
Okay.
Because there is, as Dr. De Bruyne said during the launch of the report as well, we do not have a fairly good data in terms of how consumption expenditure happens. If we had that kind of data, maybe there was a better evidence in terms of showing as to what is the clear-cut definition.
I agree with you. The last consumption expenditure data came in 2011, and therefore there is a data vacuum over there. Well, let me get initial thoughts from the other guests. Dr. Kapoor, Soumya, since you look at the here and the now, the latest data, is there a fear that because of COVID, this inequality has gotten worse?
Yeah, thank you, Lata, for having me on the show. No, I think COVID actually was a crisis of significant proportions. And although there has been no formal study, I understand this is a study which looks into even though I honestly have not gone through the report, but I understand that this is actually a study on the inequality and the distribution across the different deciles of population, if I understand correctly. And there has been evidence that because of the income, because of the lockdowns, there has been a significant shift of laborers to the agricultural sector, basically the reverse migration. And given the fact that there was an increase in demand in the Nariga during the crisis, that actually speaks of the possible income loss and hence accentuated of the income inequality during the period. But having said, so there is, there is no formal study on this, but it is clear that there is evidence of income destruction, and given the fact that there was a huge demand and supply destruction. But given all this background, I think the point on the table is that how do you support such inequality in a diverse country like India? So I think that's a challenge which we need to look into in a holistic approach. There has been, if we have time, we can discuss that. I think this Urban Nariga is a very good idea, but I am not sure about the logistical challenges of implementing it in a country as vast as India, where there is in fact data on the labor is actually a little bit on the minimal side.
That is the problem.
If I take all this factors.
No, I take your point. You put the key question on the table. So let me come to that, although that is at the last chapter with recommendations. It becomes important. Dr. Charan Singh, rural MNREGS was possible to some extent because it was located at the block level or at the panchayat level, where there is a bit of an administration and where there is a bit of a revolving population. In urban areas, there could be other problems as people, there's constant migrations. Do you think an urban guarantee scheme is the way forward?
Thank you very much for getting me in the discussion. If you don't mind, can I simply make one general observation and then take your question directly?
Sure.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I know you're running out of time. Now, the issue is, in a country like ours, as just been mentioned, very diverse country, various different states, all of them in different categories of per capita income, and all of them different geographical situations. So the inequality in the society in our country has been prevalent for a very long time, even thousands of years.
Yes.
That is, which you all understand, the stratification of the society, as well as the country is the size of a continent.
Yes.
So therefore, the differences within states is also massive, and that brings in different factors of production. Sure. And some industry dominates in some MSMEs, in some agriculture, and therefore the inequality in the country has to be accepted. And I'm very happy to say that to that extent, that acceptance is there. Now, because it's so diverse, there's a need for a multidimensional analysis, and that's exactly what this report has done. Has looked at various different aspects: education, assets, health, and of course per capita income. Now, the question which you directly asked, I've been thinking about this. I'm myself not a great fan of the idea of urban Manrega, but the logistics and application of it to me is reasonably simple. And here is one example. During my surveys with the MSMEs, most of the MSMEs would tell me, because this rural Manrega, people go away in the month of just before Diwali and they come back after Holi. So because Manrega is there, they are well employed within their native places and they don't feel the need to come here. And we as MSMEs have to carry double the labor force on our payrolls, because when these guys will go and when will they come back becomes a real challenge. And I like their idea. And I think this needs to be dwelt upon. They said you can start Manrega and ask us to dispense it. So we will run the Manrega for government. The labor doesn't have multifold income sources that they come and work with us for some months. Then they go and avail Manrega and we suffer. And then they come back and we don't want to lose them. So we employ them. And we end up raising our own cost. So the application of Manrega, if it has to be done on the urban scenario, it's possible. And I think if we do it through the MSMEs, and my examples, my surveys that I've done, and one of the surveys I did was in sports industry in Punjab, and they were so explicit about it. But then my surveys have also been in Bangalore. So application of urban Manrega is also possible through local bodies, local municipal corporations. The last point I want to make here is, with the Aadhaar card seeding that has happened, and he will know because in the banking industry, most of the seeding of accounts has been done with Aadhaar card. And DBT can be used for transfer of resources under Manrega. So it's far more easier now than when it was initially discussed and thought about 7-8 years ago.
I agree with you. I agree with you that digitalization will help. Now, I have to take a mandatory break. But before that, Dr. Kapoor, you know, if one accepts MNREGS, the rural MNREGS, of course, is taking about 1.2 lakh crore, let's assume. If the urban employment guarantee takes another 1.2 lakh crore, and a basic income, I mean, that's another of the ideas you put on the table, a basic income for all Indians, and you want that minimum income raised as well, you know, one should assume that would be another, probably 1.2 lakh crore wouldn't be enough, that would be another 3 lakh crore. That won't leave anything for capex, isn't it? Ultimately, we need growth. So do you think your two key recommendations, basic income and MNREGS, may leave very little for infrastructure and growth stimuli?
So I think, again, Lata, this is important to see that when we are, what is it that we are trying to suggest? I'm not trying to say that it is just that you just have universal basic income or you just have employment guarantee scheme in the urban areas. What we are really trying to say is that there has to be a combination, or we need to look at this. Because we need to find a way that how do we really create a basic living standard for people? Are we in a position to do that or not? Because with the kind of disparities that exist, it is important that we really raise those living standards. But of course, we have to look at more from an aggregated view, because what the government is already doing is effectively towards, or a movement towards, improving the quality of life or standard of living. Can we aggregate it as a measure to understand what is happening? And I'm not saying that you have to really invest 120 lakh crores or whatever. What we are saying is that we have to look at it from an integrated point of view. And I absolutely accept your point that India has to invest in infrastructure. In fact, the most critical thing is going to be the educational infrastructure, because there is a very clear evidence that if a person actually gets educated for one additional year after class 8, his income rises by close to about 8,000 rupees per year. So that means the educational infrastructure has to be strengthened. The other infrastructure or social infrastructure has to be strengthened, but supported with an integrated view. If you are part of urban guarantee scheme, you don't have to be part of the
of the basic income.
Basic income. But having said that, I think there is also an issue of productivity in terms of saying as to what is the right salary that we need to really look at. What is that quality of life that you have to give to your people? So this is where we will have to understand or have a very clear definition of what we mean by poverty, or what do we mean by poor, because we've not had a very clear definition within the country in terms of what poverty actually means. Because there has been the Tendulkar Committee report or whatever, but should we really talk about absolute poverty? Should we talk about abject poverty or whatever? We need to really get into those definitions as well.
Okay, fair point. And we have to create more jobs, as your report says, in several points. So then it becomes a growth versus distribution debate as well, a debate which is as old as independent India. A little more on those issues after a very short break.